So welcome everybody, welcome Vincent, and welcome also to this video conversation of the Theological Research News of the Catholic University of Leuven. My name is Judith Gruber. I am Professor of Systematic Theology here at the Faculty of Theology, and I'm also the Director for the Center for Liberation Theology. And today I'm having the privilege of having a conversation with Professor Vincent Lloyd from Villanova University. Professor Vincent Lloyd is Associate Professor of Theology and Religious Studies at Villanova University, where he also directs the Villanova Political Theology Project. Vincent, you specialize in political theology and also in African American religious thought, and your research focuses on questions about the intersection of religious and political ideas using interdisciplinary methods. You're a prolific writer, a renowned speaker, and we are very privileged to have you here. And I would like our conversations to really circle around the two fields of political theology as they intersect with the field of race in theology. And so perhaps my first question really uses your book, The Problem with Grace, as a springboard. I've been fascinated by the way you try to reconfigure political theology here. And I think you're doing a very insightful and very inspiring job of analyzing how projects of political theology so far were based or are working with a silent binary opposition. A binary opposition that opposes grace and work, grace and the law, transcendence and immanence. And I think you show very clearly how political thought and theological thought intersects in working with these binary oppositions. And the proposal you make is really saying we have to look at political theology differently. We have to supersede these binary oppositions and take a look at the practices in which theological concepts such as grace, such as the law, such as transcendence and immanence are actually shaped and emerge from concrete political practices. Could you perhaps elaborate on that? And perhaps we can also have a conversation about how these dynamics work now in the US and in Europe.
Well, thank you so much for welcoming me to Leuven and to this beautiful space. I'm looking forward to getting to know the Leuven community here. Yes, I've been thinking about the ways that the very dynamic theological conversations about grace, law, supersessionism are also have relevance for broader culture. Right? Grace and law are not just technical theological terms, but they also play a role in how we think about our worlds outside of a strictly theological framework. So when we think, for example, about a nation or a people that is bound by some repressive regime, and regime change is necessary to be freed from this repression, to live a flourishing life. It seems to me that there's an instinct there that mirrors the theological worry about Christian grace replacing a caricature of Jewish law. And that's something that we ought to be worried about in the cultural and political world as well, because as we see when regime change is attempted in the political context, often things get much worse rather than getting better.
Right. So what could be visions for embettering the world then, and other theological visions?
Yes, yeah. So on the one hand, my instinct is to say, rather than looking from the top down, we should look from the bottom up, rather than looking for one set of concepts that will save us if only they're embraced, one set of practices or one new regime that can be implemented and then allow for flourishing. What if we look at the practices of flourishing that are already there, even in ostensibly constricted or narrow social or cultural contexts, right? There's still people finding truth and beauty and goodness. And if we attend to those moments, and allow them to energize and inform our sort of political strivings. That seems like a better direction to go about.
But wouldn't that also not completely change how we understand theology or the task of theology? Does theology then become perhaps, rather than a translation of a depositum that is already given, of a language we can dispose of a language we have, of concepts which are God-given? It's a very different practice of discernment, perhaps, of looking for what could perhaps, I'm not sure you would agree with the term, but could be called something like anonymous theologies, already being at work and looking for theological language there and seeing how theology has always already emerged from such struggles, from such desires for beauty, for truth, for justice.
Yes, yeah. I think imagining theology as a conceptual cathedral constructed out of this sort of deposit of concepts that have existed since time immemorial, or at least thousands of years, that is very misleading, and it leads to a desire for mastery of those concepts, of that architecture. And then once mastery has been achieved, right, a sense of ownership and entitlement, which comes along with an exclusion of others. Whereas if we turn from concepts to practices, from systems to prayers, even, right, or to strivings or struggles, then we can find ways of not imagining theology anew, but bringing to life the theology that is already there and holding it up for what it is.
So in a way that kind of envisions two different ways of doing theology in new ways. I think on the one hand it really shifts authority of theological authority to other places in a way. And at the same time, for me, that also very much raises the question of how established theological discourses have bolstered, have sponsored oppression then in other ways, by inhabiting, by building what you have just called conceptual cathedrals. So is that something which is on your mind as well as you look for liberative theologies?
Yes, I think that ambivalence of theology as a discipline and the history of theology as a discipline is, of course, important to attend to, both as something that has excluded and has played into dynamics of mastery and domination, but also as a site that reminds us that the world does not have the last word, right? That there is more to the status quo, more to the world than the status quo wants us to think that there is, more than ideology wants us to think that there is, and that theology as a discipline at its best is resourcing those ways of imagining otherwise.
So there's good and bad theology.
Theology can always be ambivalent.
Yes. I think that's a more nuanced way of putting it. Could you perhaps give us an example of some of those ambivalent theological concepts? I think I read a fantastic piece by you about charisma. Would that perhaps be something where we can show how this ambivalence works as well? So
both charisma and law, to take two concepts here, are sites that can be understood as part of a caricature of supersessionism or cultural supersessionism, a caricature of Judaism as just about following rules provided by a system, policed by authority, and on the other hand, sort of redemption by a new regime or by an individual who embodies the good, the true, and the beautiful in oneself. So if one thinks, for example, of portrayals of Moses, right? Charlton Heston in the Ten Commandments, right? This Hollywood version of Moses is an embodiment of masculinity and Americanness and power and mastery, which is very different from the biblical Moses, right? Very different from the person stammering or stuttering, always hesitating, always working through intermediaries between himself and God, between himself and the people. So I worry that when we look for charisma or for law, we look for the Moses of Charlton Heston or the Pharaoh of the Ten Commandments, rather than what we find in the really rich biblical text.
And that also tells us that not only theology is ambivalent, are the conceptual cathedrals of perhaps ecclesial communities, but perhaps even the normative and normativized texts, the foundation of those conceptual cathedrals, have that ambiguity built into them. So I think if I hear you right, there are different ways of reading that, and they might justify both ways of reading them themselves.
Yes, and I think that to watch and to read take virtues, right? They take a sort of formation of character that, at its best, theological education and the liberal arts more generally as a mode of education can train us into, can form us into. But we can also forget how to read well and how to watch well and how to attend when various cultural forces are making us look for celebrity rather than for a more democratic or theological kind of charisma.
How do we develop a democratic theology then?
Yes, I think acknowledging the critical force of theology and the critical instincts, even when they're misrepresented in a constructive edifice-building direction, appreciating their critical potential is important, while at the same time being very hesitant to speak in the positive. A sort of linguistic ascesis seems like it can be recommended to most people who call themselves theologians, at least when they're speaking in the positive. The paradox of theology, of course, is that it's impossible to say true words about God when any words about God are going to be false.
Right.
It makes one perplexed, right? But if what theologians can do forcefully and confidently is to say say what is false, to name idols, and very hesitantly can gesture toward stammerings that are in the direction of the true, the good, and the beautiful.
That is very interesting. I think it taps very strongly into forms of radical critique that would be very hesitant, that would embrace stammering, as you say, that would embrace hesitance about positive formulations, but that also, of course, implies hesitance about institutionalizing what I would like to call good theology in a way, right? So how do we envision communities then? How do we form communities, or how can communities congeal around such stammering forms of good theology?
Yes, I think the appreciation of the tragic and fallen nature of the world is a prerequisite, right? That every institution that we find ourselves in, and we always find ourselves in institutions formed by structures, participating in structures whether we like it or not, is going to get some things wrong, right? The desire to find an institution, find a structure, find a formation that gets everything right is the same supersessionist desire to set aside worldly law and realize in this world a form of divine, pure grace. So once we have that prerequisite orientation toward fallenness, I think attending to voices at the margins, right? Yeah. And not realizing that attention is going to be an ongoing process that's going to get things wrong over and over again. But as Gillian Rose, who I wrote my dissertation about, said, the task is not to try to get things right, but to fail better again and again. And that process of failing better is one that feels threatening and precarious and unsettling, but also is essential if we want to do theology well and to flourish.
So in a way that kind of gets away or finds a third way that lies between, on the one hand, saying just ideology is overpowering and there's no agency at all for those who are oppressed, for what Spivak decades ago called the subaltern, and the other hand, kind of what I would like to call perhaps a naive way of celebrating the agency at the margins, and instead, in what you might call as something as postponing eschatology, seeing how within a dominant framework of perhaps idolatry and ideology, finding ways of making space for agency within it, without ever believing we can supersede the supersessionist approach is possible. Is that perhaps something I kind of recognize that thought in new ways of thinking critical theories, perhaps also in one strand which comes to my mind is Afro-pessimism. So this is a big jump now, right, from talking about theology, a theology of virtues, a biblical theology, but recognizing those strands also in other discourses. And as I said, Afro-pessimism. Let us make this jump with Achille Mbembe, whose translation of the Critique of Black Reason is recently both in Europe as in the United States, I think, is informing ways, thinking in new ways, and really tries to think about, on the one hand, the pervasiveness of ideological buildings that are oppressive, that are exploitative, and still looks within that for ways of how the oppressed, in their practices, find space to claim their dignity, in a way, find space not just to dignity, as you say, as in a conceptual way, but really practices of surviving, practices of living on. And for Achille Mbembe and others, it is this superstructure, this ideological superstructure in ways perhaps would be race very much. And I think this is perhaps a way of touching on in your theological research, race feeds into as well. And I would be interested in guiding our conversation towards that of how your political theology intersects with analysis of how race really is one of those discourses that shape very much our thinking. And I haven't mentioned this yet before, but we are here in the chapel of the Holland College, one of the oldest buildings that the KU Leuven still has and is still very well preserved. And that chapel has a lot of preserved elements as Baroque elements. And so we are kind of surrounded here by Central European history. And at the same time, I think, in perhaps an associative way, without being too nuanced about my architectural history or my art history, here I think we can draw lines to Spanish Baroque, right? Or to ways of how Baroque chapels, Baroque churches, Baroque architecture has been one of the most forceful tools for establishing colonial dominance in the New World, right? And it's quite a striking experience, which doesn't hit you so much when you come here in Belgium, in Flanders, into such a Baroque chapel. But when you enter such Baroque architecture in Latin America and in the Americas, it really hits you, and it's striking to see how they are full with iconography that imagines sainthood, that imagines divinity as white, right? And so I think it's very interesting to think about these intersections between theological knowledge production, the Christian imagination on the one hand, and racial imaginations, the construction of race. And there has been recently quite a lot of research done into this, and I think you are very much participating into looking into these intersections. And so I would like to perhaps talk with you about the question of how race shapes Christian imagination, how Christian imagination shapes race, and then perhaps in a second step of how that impacts of how we should practice theology again.
Yes, there's been some very exciting scholarship recently thinking about the way that Christian supersessionism, in terms of anti-Judaism, transforms into an anti-indigeneity or anti-Indian sort of conceptual structure and an anti-black structure as Christianity comes to the Americas and comes together with colonialism and comes together with slavery and the challenges or difficulties that were already within Christianity and that were already giving rise to anti-Jewish violence in Europe were now transferred into colonial forms of genocide and enslavement. And those are legacies that we're still grappling with and that are still very much alive. I think one of the powerful things about Afro-pessimism as a theoretical framework is that it reminds us that slavery was not just a set of laws, but a set of habits and institutions and ways of imagining and norms. And in order to get us to get one person to think of another person as less than human, as like an animal, it takes a whole lot of work, right? So it takes a huge sort of ideological infrastructure, and just switching a law doesn't get rid of that, right? There's this huge continuity of norms, practices, institutions, ways of thinking, ways of imagining that after the end of slavery continues in North America and in other parts of the world. And whether we're talking about prisons in the U.S. or post-colonial issues in Africa, and that force of anti-black racism is still, as it's entangled with Christianity, still leaves much for us to grapple with from a theological perspective.
And how do you think that should change how we do theology once we see how theology has been implicated in building that infrastructure?
Yes, so if on the one hand theology works, can speak confidently in the negative, right?
Yes.
And can speak confidently when disclaiming idolatry. And we see idolatries of whiteness, right? Whiteness associated with God, right? Whiteness associated with confidence and mastery. Yeah. And not just whiteness as a sort of set of people, but as a set of habits and institutions. That is something that theologians, together with their critical theorists and cultural studies colleagues, can speak out about, and can bring a unique perspective to from their background, thinking about idolatry, and in a positive voice, right? If the truest, although still false words that can be spoken theologically are from those experiencing domination, right? Those at the margins, and if the world is in various ways under the power of anti-black and anti-black racism and other forms of structures of domination, patriarchy, homophobia, and others, then listening to the voices of those who suffer the most from those forms of domination ought to be a starting point for our theological reflections.
I think what I'm hearing here is also that perhaps the power to speak confidently in the negative, confidently, critically about those traditions and those legacies we have, might then also be distributed in uneven ways across the theological community. I think I'm very struck by how you say theology can speak with confidence, and at the same time we are deeply entangled into those legacies. So are there ways of thinking that within the theological community there are differences along those lines of who can have confidence, and how do we draw those lines?
Yes, I mean, there are also all of the systems of domination that infect the world, that make the world fallen, are found in the Theological Academy, right? Yeah. Patriarchy and homophobia and anti-black racism and colonialism and colonialism's legacies and many more, right, are found within the Theological Academy. And so, I mean, the kind of critical work and negative, voice that in laboratory conditions, theologians would speak with to the world, also in the fallen world, is something that theologians within the academy must speak with respect to their own guild.
Do you envision any concrete ways of how the academy can grapple with this.
Yes, so on the one hand, I think it's difficult for those in positions of relative comfort and privilege, as I am now in a professorship at a university in the U.S. to give advice to those challenging the very structures that I inhabit. And I think there's a danger when those inside institutions start to speak for or even with, in an uneven way, those outside of institutions and challenging institutions. But resourcing and creating space for those outside of institutional contexts does seem like a task that we ought to try and necessarily fail at, and try to feel better at, and in the process to gain an appreciation of the road from. Whereas Samuel Beckett has us failing, trying again, feeling better, but ultimately living in the muck, right? For Gillian Rose, right, that process of feeling better is one that allows for a life of flourishing, right? A life of appreciation of the glances or glimmers of beauty and truth and goodness that we can only fleetingly see, but that in the process of attending to marginalized communities, we can be enlivened with.
So I think for me the question here is how a pessimism in the right sense, a pessimism that does not lead to inertia, melancholic inertia, but sees glimmering, and how this again can be institutionalized in the academy in a way, and also what kind of concrete political steps that takes and decisions that takes, and also long-term planning it takes in our institution, in our academic institutions. I'm wondering if that plays out differently across on two sides of the Atlantic. You're at home in US American institutions. We are here in Europe. I feel that while in the US, the idea of race, the concept of race, and the critical understanding of how race functions has gained some traction for a long time, actually. This is a discourse which is only very, very slowly emerging on this side of the Atlantic. Due to different histories, I think here there's still a strong resistance to talking about race, because race has been really used as a biologistic concept and has that legacy from the Holocaust onwards. And I think in Europe we would really gain from adopting a critical concept of race too, that allows us to look into this history, not in thinking we just inherited history, but getting some distance from it. And so I would like kind of asking for your advice, perhaps, in certain ways of how you think, what kind of new questions could open up here in Europe once we look through the lens of race. So is that something which you think could be used here for theological knowledge production in European countries, European contexts as well?
It's a big question, but I mean, one of the things that I think has been inspiring in recent years in the U.S. context is that institutions, including Catholic institutions like Georgetown, but more recently Princeton Theological Seminary and others, have been spending time examining their own histories, their own entanglements with the slave trade and with colonialism in the West Indies and more generally. After examining that history, right after doing the descriptive work, having community conversations about what the right prescriptions are, how to move forward, given that legacy that has been surfaced, given that some of these institutions are made possible, their wealth is generated by histories of slavery or colonialism. What does that mean, not just in terms of sort of a dollar figure, right, a financial calculation, but in terms of incalculable obligation, right, that is an obligation to reconfigure the cultural landscape, right? Rather than just bringing up, a couple or a few who have been left behind. So I think that style of conversation is a sense of descriptive work coupled with a normative conversation about where do we go forward when we're thinking beyond dollar or euro or pound figures of reparations or of making right? If making right is not something that humans can do, but is what God does, then what is it that humans, that institutions that do have enormous resources and power are able to do? And I don't think those are questions that I or we can answer now or from this position, but they're conversations that after the descriptive work is done, right, after that sort of deep unraveling of those entanglements in colonialism, but also I think in patriarchy, right, in the exclusion of women from positions of power in these institutions. Those are histories that need to be told.
So I think what I'm hearing very much, of course, is there are no easy solutions and perhaps no solution at all in the long term, fitting very much into what you talked earlier about the fallenness of the world and thinking of salvation, redemption, perhaps not as an overarching theme that can be reached at some point, but more as a work that interrupts the fallenness of the world, if we're lucky, in little glimmers in a way, and really thinking about this too in terms of race in Europe, in terms of colonialism in Europe, I think is a very fruitful way, but also again a very difficult. I think you really speak to the difficulties here and the struggles that are here. And what I'm also hearing is that this perhaps requires, beyond the dollar and the euro very much of what can be fixed, new imaginations of who we are and where we are and who and where we are, how that intersects. And I'm perhaps also reminded of the work to be done here in terms of what Alan Busak, South African theologian, called the loss of innocence, right? So can we perhaps say that little redemption, or small steps of salvation can be found by losing innocence, by finding a home in different ways in the fallen world. Would that be perhaps a way of looking into it? And that should not look at a reconciliatory way of looking at it, but really as a big challenge, right, of how we reimagine ourselves.
Yes, although I wonder sometimes whether, in a sense, whether the sense that we or Europeans or certain Americans are wallowing in some kind of innocence is a very classed kind of experience, right? It's one that is about sort of comfortable upper middle class life, and working class folks and folks dealing with poverty on their daily life, struggling to find how to eat, even in well-to-do countries. This sense of this language of innocence might not capture their experiences so well, and even in relatively comfortable life, there are moments when we sort of face the inexplicable and face that which we cannot overcome. We are all facing death. We are all facing suffering, and I think sometimes it's easy to repress. The ideology of innocence represses that, right. And so lifting that, finding ways to hold up those, the ways that we all already, regardless of our position, are forced to grapple with the way that we're not in control.
Right. So in a way, not only interrupting that arch, that eschatological arch in temporal ways, but also in spatial ways to see what are experiences, very liminal experiences in a way, liminal experiences where our world ends, and going to these places also to find different ways of looking at the world. Yeah, absolutely. And again, the question of how does that feature on both sides of the Atlantic in very concrete communities, in very concrete institutions, perhaps. And I think what I'm very much taking away from that conversation is the the need for theologians, the kind of our job description for theologians to stay wakeful, right? To know that things can go very wrong, to know about the ambivalence of theology, and still hold on in ways of trying to look for those stammering, those struggling for words that are really at the core of our business. So Vincent, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to have you here as a guest in Leuven, and I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you so much.